This now. Welcome to the Paul Pratt Memorial Library's Grow into Spring Gardening Series. This is a three-part lecture series featuring some local gardening experts. First one up is Russ Cohen. He had been the Rivers Advocate for the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game's Division of Ecological Restoration, where he was an expert in riparian vegetation, and I'm sure he can explain that a little bit further than I can. But some of you may be familiar with his tours at Holly Hill Farm in Cohasset. Next week will be Kate Donovan from Blackstone Valley Veggie Gardens, who will talk about pollinating plants, or it's on our website. And the third one is going to be Chris Kennedy from Kennedy Country Gardens. That will be in the fall. They're rather busy right at the moment, so we've had to reschedule that for the fall. Thank you all for attending. And I'd just like to give a shout out to our sponsor, the Community Garden Club of Cohasset. And Russ?
Thank you, Gail. So hi, everyone. And let me just explain at the beginning that you're never going to actually see me. You're just going to see my PowerPoint slides. I don't actually have a camera on my computer screen. So the good news for me is I don't have to tidy up the room I'm giving this talk in, because you can't see it. But anyways, you get to hear me and watch my slides. And I'll be on this intro slide for a few minutes before I plunge into the show. And I've kept it in this mode because I seem to recall from a prior time when I gave a Zoom talk that when I went to full screen, there was a delay in the slides and people weren't seeing them in a way that corresponded with me talking. So I'm going to keep it in this mode so that the slides are coordinated better. So you can just ignore the preview slides off to the left and just focus on the main image that's taking up most of the thing. All right, so yes, this was supposed to be an in-person talk in the library, and so I'm sorry that that's not happening. And one of the things that I would have done differently had we been all together in one place is I would be serving you things to nibble and sip on made from wild ingredients, native ingredients that I love to share with attendees in my live programs. So sorry I won't be able to do that. You will know about those things and see images of various desserts and drinks and stuff like that I make from some of these native plants as we go through this show today. So, so what I want to do first is talk about the ecological values of native plants, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the talk talking about how many of our native plants are edible by people too. So let's go. All right, so if this were a live audience, I'd be asking how many of the people in the audience have ever heard of a guy named Doug Tallamy. So let me just see if I can click on this image and get a view of him by clicking right here. See if this works. Okay, I'm not getting my animations happening. That's a drag. Okay, let's see if I can. All right, so no animations, that's fine. We'll do without them. All right, so Doug is an entomologist from the University of Delaware, and he discovered very astutely that when our migrating tropical songbirds return to build nests and raise babies and stuff in the spring, and the parent birds are searching around for things to feed their babies in the nest, they're feeding them caterpillars. And where the birds are getting those caterpillars is off of native plants. Why is that? It's because since plants can't move, their major defense is chemical. And our native insects have figured out ways to get around the defenses of our native plants. Now there's a dynamic equilibrium between the insects and the bugs and the plants because the plants wouldn't want, the bugs wouldn't want to eat the plants to extinction, then they'd lose their food. So they eat enough so that they can nourish themselves but the plants continue to exist, and the birds benefit from all this because the birds find the caterpillars to feed their babies in the nest. And so Doug's point is that if you care about birds, you should care about planting native in your yard because that's where the birds get their food. So there's been lots of groups involved in planting native plants, and lots of state agencies have been promoting planting natives, and that's all good. So here's a talk I went to several years ago given by a wonderful woman named Kate Venturini from Rhode Island. And she works with homeowners along the shore in Narragansett Bay to try to get them to plant native plants. And as part of her show, she includes a chart like this. And those of you that are work a lot with plants have seen charts like this all the time. We have the name of the plant on the left and the various columns on the right talking about various attributes these plants have. So they'll say it grows tall, grows short, like sun, like shade. So I went up to Kate at the end of her talk and I said, Kate, where's your edibility column? And she said, oh, we don't tell people that. We want people to leave these plants for the wildlife. So I said to Kate, oh, that's interesting. You have blueberry on your list. Are you suggesting that people plant blueberries and then never go out and pick a blueberry themselves? Oh, we wouldn't do that. So then I said to Kate, well, you might as well tell them what else is edible. So based on information they got with me now in Rhode Island, they have an edibility column in the information they share with people. And here's the point of this talk. The fact that many of our native species are edible by people too provides an additional powerful incentive for people to plant those plants in their yard, where they might be insufficiently induced to do so just on the pure ecological argument. So pardon me while I dwell on stereotypes for a minute. So in my mind, I imagine a suburban couple living on a good sized lot out in the suburbs, and the wife has seen Doug Tallamy's talk, or she's read his book, and she's convinced it's really important for us to go native in our landscaping. We need to do this. And the husband says, I like the yard the way it is. I don't want to change anything. So that's when she could bring him to one of my talks and learn about all these edible native plants. It's the what's in it for me too angle. And I freely admit that I know it's not going to get everybody to rip out their lawn and put in native plants, but my hunch is that it will win an additional group of people that aren't sold in just the pure, to use a pejorative expression, just a pure bug and bunny argument. Do it because it's good for the bugs and the bunnies. All right, so how do you know if a plant is native? Well, if you're in Massachusetts, you can consult this book, the Yellow Book, and then you look up and see if a plant is deemed to be native to your county. And then there's a really good online resource I use all the time called Go Botany. So if you're in New England, very valuable resource. You can see here for spicebush how these black lines here are county boundaries, and you'll see that where it's colored green, that means that species is deemed to be native in that county. So this is spicebush, which we'll talk about later in the show. So that's a great source to use. And then there's also the issue of ecoregions. And of course, plants aren't growing based on political boundaries. That's not important to them. Plants pay more attention to ecoregions. And so if a plant is deemed to be native in your ecoregion, to me, that's more important than if a plant is deemed to be native to your state or not. So for example, black walnut is deemed by botanists to be not technically native to Massachusetts, but it's native to Connecticut. And Eastern Mass is in the same ecoregion as Connecticut, so I consider it to be native to Eastern Massachusetts. So, and another issue about ecotype is some people feel very strongly that you should be only planting local ecotype plants. And there's various reasons for that. And I'll just say that if you are able to obtain local ecotype seed or local ecotype plants, plants that were grown nearby in similar conditions to what you have, it just increases the chances of success of you planting those plants that they'll do well at your site. So that's a practical reason for wanting to go local ecotype, if for nothing else. So the next slide, and I apologize, I can't go through all the images here because I'm just not getting the animation to run, but I'll just tell you that there is a great aspect of the Native Plant Trust website called the Plant Finder. And you can click on this, and there's various attributes that you can say that describe your yard. So you could say, I have a dry yard, I have a sunny yard, whatever. And so it will pull up plants that will grow in those conditions, in dry and sunny conditions. And also you can query the database on edibility, and it will pop up with 80 species of native edible plants show up in the database. There's actually 180, but 80 is at least a good start. So, so I encourage you to go to Plant Search, which is part of the Native Plant Trust website. So the rest of the time, we're going to be talking about specific examples of edible native plants for the rest of the show. So here's ostrich fern. This is the quote unquote fiddlehead fern, the kind you see for sale in the stores. It's pretty easy to find these in a plant nursery. It doesn't even have to be one that's devoted to native plants. Regular conventional plant nurseries often carry this species. And although its natural habitat, and I'll just go on to the next slide. So its natural habitat looks like this. It's alluvial floodplain soil. The ostrich fern will grow pretty much anywhere. It doesn't like it really rocky or really dry. So if you've got a dry, rocky site, probably not great for ostrich fern. But other than that, it's good. And this is a good point to talk about conservation, especially on the subject of picking edible plants from wild populations. If those edible plants are harvesting are native, it's good to remember that native plants often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals will rely upon them for food and some other important portion of their life cycle. So when you're gathering native plants from wild populations, I encourage people to use some forbearance and restraint just to make sure you're not going to pick more than you should for ecological reasons. So in the terms of the ostrich fern fiddlehead, I encourage people to pick one or maybe two of the curled up parts per clump. That's it. Let the rest grow out, and that is a totally sustainable level of harvesting. Because if you picked all of these and you see the plant holds a couple in reserve in the base and they grow out, and a week or two later you or somebody else goes into the woods and they pick all of those fiddleheads too, that's sapping a lot of strength from the rhizome. You could actually kill a plant by harvesting it that hard. So one or two per clump, that's the sustainable way of doing it. And so the slide talks about the other ways to distinguish the ostrich fern from other species of fern. So it's in a vase-shaped clump, so look for that. And also these little papery scales that are on the outside of the curled up part, they come off really easily with your finger, so it's not like a wool, like a cinnamon fern. And then you see this little gouge running down the center of the little stem. So if we cut that stem in cross section, you see it forms a U-shaped cross section. So look for that. And then the last thing to look for are the spore-bearing fronds, these fertile fronds. And not every clump of ostrich ferns will have those, but you'll frequently see those in the cluster. And if you cut the little stem of the fertile fronds, you also see that they form a U in cross section. So, so if you've ever bought ostrich fern fiddleheads at the store and cooked them up and been not very impressed with them, you might want to consider this cooking method, which was amply demonstrated to me by this naturalist, Beth Basler, who took a bunch of us to a patch of fiddleheads growing along the Connecticut River out in the town of Northfield, Mass. And she brought her camp stove with her to the ostrich fern patch. And we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after we picked them. And they were truly exquisite that way. So here's an example of ostrich ferns deployed in the landscape. So this is just a typical suburban yard in Lexington, Mass, just outside of Boston. And I would wager that all these ostrich ferns weren't planted. They planted some, and this plant will naturally spread like this vegetatively. So, so it actually is a plant that will proliferate. So if you've got a teeny yard and you're concerned about plants that have an assertive vegetative growing habit, this might not be the best choice for you. But other than that, ostrich ferns is good choice for landscaping. It's a very nice looking plant, even if you never ate it. All right, so here's marsh marigold, and I've grown this one from seed. So these in this tray right here are seed grown plants from plants where I waited till the plants bloomed and then went to seed. The plants are in seed right now in the Boston area. So if you know where there's a patch of marsh marigolds, you could try and collect some seed. And you can sow it right now, or you can store it and sow it later. The time to eat marsh marigolds is when they look like this. So before the flowers come out. And you have to boil these leaves to make them safe to eat. They're actually toxic raw, and I would actually encourage changing the water once before you eat them. And the flavor and the texture is quite similar to cooked spinach. But this is a gorgeous one of our native flowering plant species. So when I'm gathering these in wild populations, I'm picking just 1 or 2 leaves per clump. That's it. And that's a sustainable level of harvest. And I've seen places where marsh marigolds are growing where they're like under alder thickets where there are thousands of these plants. So if you're seeing a patch that big, even if you're just picking 1 or 2 leaves per plant, you're still getting quite a lot to enjoy as a cooked vegetable. All right, and here is a slide of violets that I might just try and show this exact slide because I really need to show you the. So tell me, Gail, if we run into a lag when I switch to full screen mode like this, and we can go back to the preview mode.
Sure.
So these are your classic lawn violets, and that's where I took this photo. And this is the Viola sororia. This is the species that you see the most frequently. There are many different violet species. There are none that are where the leaves and flowers are poisonous, but there are some where they might have a laxative effect. But if you just stick to this really common one, the Viola sororia or the dooryard violet, with a heart-shaped, shiny purple leaves and the purple flower, with a heart-shaped, shiny purple leaf, the heart-shaped shiny leaves, and the purple flowers. That's the species. That's the one I recommend. And this is a great species for diversifying your lawn with these violets because they don't mind getting mowed or stepped on. And although I haven't succeeded in propagating these from seed, I have been able to dig these up from my lawn and pot them up and plant them in other places, and they've done very well. So let's see what happens when I click on this image. Okay, so there are the flowers. Gail, you seeing an image of violet flowers?
Yes.
All right. Oh, it's great. It's working. And now you're seeing a cake?
Yes.
All right, so we're going to stay in full screen mode the rest of the show. That's excellent. So this is a black walnut cake that my wife actually made, and she decorated with candied violet flowers. So that's another fun way to use the native dooryard violet. All right. So here is milkweed, and this is a plant I'm harvesting right now, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So I call it a procrastinating forager's dream food because there's actually at least 4 edible stages to milkweed. And by the way, it's the common milkweed is the edible one. So none of the other milkweed species I know of are edible. So like butterfly weed isn't edible, swamp milkweed isn't edible, just the common milkweed. And so it's the shoots, the leaves off the slightly older shoots, the flower buds, which we're seeing in the photo right now, and the pods are all edible. And this is the same cooking method you use for any of these milkweed parts. Is what you do is you get a pot of water boiling on the stove, drop whatever milkweed part you're cooking into the water, and boil it for 7 minutes. And that is a totally sufficient amount of cooking to make the milkweed part completely palatable, actually quite tasty and safe to eat. And I have found that the milkweed will not shrink or get all mushy on you even after all that boiling. So the plants are at this stage right now in the Boston area, the milkweed bud stage. So when these buds are in a nice tight green cluster, you pick them off, including any little leaves with them, and then boil them for 7 minutes. And so the milkweed buds in this photo right here have been boiled for 7 minutes. So if anything, they look even nicer than they did on the plant. So you could eat these just as a vegetable side dish, just like that, or you can incorporate them into different dishes. So in my foraging book, I've got a recipe for milkweed egg puff, which is like a cross between a souffle and a casserole, and the milkweed buds work really well in that recipe. So as I also mentioned, the pods, when they're up to an inch or inch and a half long and nice and firm to the touch, you can boil these for 7 minutes, and the texture and the flavor is really similar to green beans. All right, so that's the good news in terms of people eating this plant. But as you know, this is a really important plant ecologically because it's one of the larval food hosts for the monarch butterfly. So the female butterflies seek out the milkweed plants, lay their eggs on the underside of the leaves, and the caterpillars eat the leaves and so on. And so it's really important to make sure there's lots of milkweed plants out in the environment to make sure that the butterflies find all they need. Now, I've been assured by several ecologists that the foragers are in no way responsible for the reported decline in monarch populations that we've heard about, which is comforting to know. But even so, this is a plant I'm actively propagating from seed in my nursery, and I encourage you to do it too. It's very easy. In fact, if all you do is in the fall, when you start to see the mature pods burst open with the mature seeds attached to those parachutey business things, you just gather up a couple of those pods and just throw them in your cars. You see some good habitat for milkweed plants. It doesn't have any, like the edge of a school ball field or a bike path, something like that. Just release those parachutes and help start a new colony. All right, but let me tell you a personal story of how I'm doing this in my own yard. So, oops, click on this. Oops, let me go back. And okay, what happens when I click on this image? Oh, it's not showing you. Anyway, so I will just, oh, there it is right there. And why aren't you showing me? Let's try again. Oops, I don't want that. Let's try, sorry about this technical difficulties here. All right, so going to go to this slide and then from current slide. Okay, there we go. So here is a scene of my front yard. So that's my car with my boat on it. That's my house right there. That's my garage, which I'll talk about again in a second. So here I've grown some low bush blueberries and some milkweed growing right next to my garage. And so these milkweeds, when they're small, I can harvest them and eat them. And you can go to a website called Journey North to see where the monarch butterflies are. And until they arrive in your area, in my area, it's Eastern Massachusetts, you can go ahead and eat those milkweeds with abandon because there's no butterflies seeking those plants. So when Journey North tells you, okay, the monarchs are arriving in your area, that's when you should leave the plants alone and let them grow up so the butterflies can find them. So in the meantime, this is around the time when the butterflies would be coming in the Boston area when the plants are this tall. And yes, so the butterflies have found my plants and lay the eggs on the plants. And here's how, one way I know. So this chrysalis was attached to my garage door. In fact, fortunately, the place where the butterfly attached it is a place that when the door goes up and down, the chrysalis was fine. It just rode up and down with the door as we opened and shut the garage. And one day we went out and this was empty. The butterfly had matured and metamorphosed and flown away. So yeah, so you can take action and plant milkweed locally in your own yard and eat it and leave some for the butterflies once they arrive. Okay, so here's a native species called basswood. And this is in the genus Tilia. This is Tilia americana. This is one I'm growing in my nursery. I haven't figured out how to grow it from seed yet, but I've obtained seed from, from seed I've collected. I've gotten seed from other people and grown it from seed that way. And I've also gotten plants, and this is one I planted out in the landscape. And it likes a sunny, decent soil. So not really rocky or dry soil, but decent, damp soil. And it gets to be a big tree. It can be like 50, 60 feet tall. And the young leaves are edible. So obviously you're not shinning up a 50 or 60 feet tall tree to pick the young leaves from the top of the tree. No, you're picking the young leaves from the lower branches that you can reach. And they don't have a lot of flavor, but they're very palatable, raw or cooked when they first come out. So they're going to be not this dark green, but a shiny light green when they first come out. And this photo is what the trees are going to look like next week in this area when these blossoms come out. And by the way, one of the ways to recognize a linden or basswood tree is this thing is called the bract. And every cluster of blossoms will have one of these light green bracts attached to it. And when you snap these off the plant, you get the flowers and the bract together, and that's totally fine. And what you do with the flowers is you make a tea from the flowers. It has a wonderful lemon honey type flavor. So it's delicious, and it's also medicinal. It's soothing to your digestive system and to your mental state at the same time. So it's a very highly regarded tea by herbalists for that reason. And another thing is this tree is populated with pollinators. So As you probably know, there's been a lot of discussion of how it's very important to plant for pollinators, and I agree, we need to do that. But usually when people think about planting for pollinators, they're thinking about planting herbaceous plants. Uh, and those are obviously very important, but there's trees that are good for pollinators too, and this is one of them. So the basswood tree is so popular with pollinators, in fact, that when the tree is blooming, you can hear the tree before you see it because you can hear the buzzing of all the insects visiting the flowers before you actually get and see the tree. So that is our native basswood tree. All right, so here's a slide that is out of sequence chronologically, but this is the best way to pick this plant out in the wild. So this is our native shadbush or juneberry or saskatoon or serviceberry. They're all names of the same thing, genus Amelanchier. We have at least 8 species here in New England, and they hybridize, so it's hard to tell them apart. But in terms of eating the fruit, you do not need to tell them apart because they're all edible. So find the trees when they're blooming in April and then go back to that spot in June. And it's going to be very soon. So I would say, within the next 2 weeks, definitely Juneberries will be ripe in the Boston area. And this is what you want to look for when the fruit is ripe. So that's a dead ripe fruit. This one is a day or two short of being ripe when it's that color. But when it's that purpley color, it's ripe. And although these fruit look like blueberries, they actually don't taste like blueberries at all. They taste like a cross between cherries and almonds. They're related plants in the rose family. And a typical Juneberry tree is 12 feet tall, and it will be covered from top to bottom with these ripe fruits. So it's a great opportunity to stuff your face right by the tree. And by the way, this is not a species you necessarily have to encounter in the wild. This is one of our native species that is deployed a lot by landscapers. So I frequently see these in parks. So you can harvest this plant in a park. And let's see if I've got the next slide queued up. What happens when I click on this? Yes. So here's a photo I took from a park in Charlestown. This is just north of downtown Boston, where I used to be able to walk on my lunch hour and visit the Juneberry trees that our state parks agency planted there. And I picked quarts of fruit on my lunch hour. And most of these fruit I would eat, but for some of them, I would grow plants from them. And this is how I would do it. Oh, this is strudel. So you make strudel from Juneberries, which is really good. So this is how you grow Juneberries from seed. So I would bring those fruit home, eat the fruit, but instead of swallowing everything, including the seeds, which are definitely edible, you can chew them up, and that's part of the almondy flavor. You can spit the seeds into your mouth, into your hand, and then put the seeds into a plastic bag and store them in your fridge. And that's called stratification. That's a process that most of our native seeds need to go through. They need to experience something like a winter to trigger germination. And so I had these seeds stored in the wintertime. And what can happen with Juneberries and also other plants in the rose family in particular is the seeds can be precocious as they decide in the middle of February, their little timers go off and the little radicals emerge from the seed and they want to be growing. And so when that happens, you have to sow the seed right away. So that's what I did. So there they are growing in my nursery, and the seeds, the Juneberry plants I grew from seed are now over 2 feet tall in my nursery. Wild strawberry is another easy one to grow from seed. This is another great species for planting in a lawn. So if you have some lawn that you don't want to give up, but you don't mind diversifying beyond grass, this is an excellent choice to put it in. I've done it in my lawn. And like the violet, the wild strawberries don't mind getting mowed or stepped on, which is great. And they produce this delectable fruit, which they are small. There's no getting around that, but they lack what they lack in size. They make up for in yumminess. And those white 5-petal flowers are populated with pollinators. And then the wild strawberry leaves you can make tea from when the leaves are fresh or thoroughly dried. Apparently, when they're wilted, they're slightly toxic, but fresh or thoroughly dried is fine. And the tea that you make from the leaves does taste at least vaguely like the fruit, and it does have vitamin C in it. So if you felt a case of scurvy coming on, you could rush out and make yourself some wild strawberry leaf tea. So yes, so you can just collect the seed from these fruits. So you could just smear it on a piece of cardboard, and then once the fruit pulp dries, you could just fleck the seeds off with your fingers, and then you can sow them right away. They don't need stratification, or you could just store them dry to be ready to store them, just like you would any seed. All right, so sometimes I will share seed that I have with other groups. So this is a girls' school out in the Berkshires in Western Mass, where they have a greenhouse on campus. And I gave them some wild strawberry seed, but you can see they just repurpose these clamshells, which are used to buy fruit like strawberries at the store, and they fill them with growing medium and then just sprinkle the wild strawberry seeds on the top. And then they grew seedling plants out, transplanted them into pots, and they were able to grow plants that were big enough to sell with their broccoli and other vegetable starts at their spring plant sale. And they tell me they did very well with those wild. So anybody that's growing plants like broccoli plants, that organic farms frequently will sell starts to their customers for growing in their own vegetable gardens. Why not grow wild strawberries too, and expand your offerings to your customers that way? All right, so here's one of our native rubus species. So this is the flowering raspberry, a gorgeous plant that would be worth considering for planting in your yard, even if you never ate it. So these maple-like leaves, when these are full grown, these can be like 8 inches across. And then these flowers are 2 inches across, so they're very showy for a plant in the rubus genus. And then the plant produces fruit. So there's the flowering raspberry fruit. I will admit that a regular red raspberry probably is a tastier, juicier fruit than these, but these are worth eating. And I forgot to tell you that these plants don't have thorns. Another reason why you might want to grow them. Now, the flowering raspberry, when I see these plants growing in the wild, they tend to like slopey, damp, dappled sun sites. So if you have that, I can pretty much guarantee you'll be able to grow flowering raspberry, but they will grow in other areas too, but that's its preferred habitat conditions. So then here's the black raspberry, and this one has a wider range of conditions it does very well in. It just wants sun. Make sure you give that. And I don't need to tell you what to do with the black raspberry fruit. These will be ripe toward the end of this month. A cool landscape interest thing about black raspberries is what they do during the off season is they have this wonderful purple color on the canes, which makes these plants very easy to identify in the off season. So you could be, it could be February, you could be out cross country skiing, walking your dog, and you see these purple thorny canes. Those are black raspberries. Remember where that spot is, and then go back and visit that spot at the end of June, early July, and look for the ripe fruit. All right, here are huckleberries. These are black huckleberries, and I'm sure a lot of people pick these thinking they're blueberries, and there's absolutely no harm in that. Black huckleberries seem to tolerate a slightly drier habitat than blueberries do. And so this is a fairly common understory species in oak woodlands here in eastern Mass. And when these plants grow in the open, which happened more in Thoreau's day, this is one of Henry David Thoreau's, they get even more prolific. So if you have a sunny site and can plant black huckleberries, they should do very well there. A cousin of this plant called the blue huckleberry, a dangleberry, you may not know. And this one tolerates shade quite well, although it will probably produce heavier berry crops in the sun. It likes it damper than the black huckleberry. One cool thing about the dangleberry is that you can still find fruit on the plant even after Labor Day, when just about any other blueberry type fruit is way gone by. These are still around. So that might be a good choice for you. Okay, so here is the common elderberry with a flat top cluster of white flowers. These plants are just starting to look like this in the Boston area now. And some people will gather these flowers and make a drink from them, or fry or use the flowers for frying it to fritters. And while I have done that, there's actually a non-native to New England species that's categorized as invasive in Massachusetts called the black locust that I think makes a much tastier fritter than these elderberries. And the other thing about picking the flowers off the plant is you won't get any fruits in any place where you pick the flowers off. And if you're picking the flowers off, you're not leaving those flowers for pollinators to visit. So I tend to just leave the flowers on the plant and wait until the ripe fruit shows up. And let me just use this common elderberry just to underscore the point I made about how our native species often have insects or other animals that rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So let me talk about that in the context of this critter right here. So this cool iridescent blue and yellow beetle is called the elderberry borer beetle. and it spends most of its life cycle associated with elderberry plants. So the adult beetles mate on the elderberry plants. The females lay their eggs in the elderberry plants. The larvae live inside the elderberry plants, and they're not harming the elderberry plants. The beetles and the plants have co-evolved for eons, so they're in dynamic equilibrium. But if this plant got over harvested in the wild and the plant began to have trouble reproducing itself, then this beetle would lose its habitat. So that's why I encourage people, when you're gathering native species from wild populations, to use some forbearance and restraint just to make sure you're leaving plenty behind for these important ecological functions to continue to exist. All right, so I mentioned that if you leave the flowers on the plant, eventually you get ripe elderberries. And this photo isn't upside down. That's what berry clusters typically do from the weight of the fruit, as they hang upside down like this. And I understand that you can get a stomach ache if you eat raw elderberries straight into your mouth. But if you dry them first or you cook them first, they're safe to eat as many as you want. And I like to mix elderberries and apples. So elderberry apple sauce, elderberry apple pie, I find more interesting than just plain applesauce and apple pie. And the last thing I'll say about elderberries is sometimes you go to these natural drugstores and you'll see these elderberry extract products where they're claiming that it's good against the flu. And I suspect that it is, but you could make your own elderberry extract. It's basically juice from the berries, and you could just pick these berries when they're ripe, which is going to be early September in this area. And just throw them in a pot with some water and simmer them for a while, and then put everything through a sieve or a food mill and through another strainer if you want to hold back the seed. And then you have the juice, which is what you could take medicinally. And you could take it fresh, you could freeze it, you could mix it with alcohol and make a tincture, which prolongs its shelf life. And there's your medicine right there. Oh, and it's very easy to grow elderberries from seeds. So you just pull the seed out of the fruits, and I stratify the seed, which means store it in the fridge and then sow it later. So here I sowed some indoors in January. You can also sow it outside. And yes, and so the plants got big enough. You see the roots coming out of the bottom of the pot. When you see that, that means these plants want to be repotted. So you could just pick out individual elderberry plants if you wanted to, or you could just punt and move the entire contents of a smaller pot into a larger pot and just let the plants get larger before you separate them and give them their own individual pot, or before you plant them out at their eventual final destination. All right, here's mayapple. So this plant is a great choice if you have a really shady, damp yard, because these plants tolerate shade very well. And these plants, like the ostrich ferns, they will spread vegetatively. And so just be aware of that if you are going to use them. So they will spread. And when that happens, you want to plant them in a place where you don't mind if that happens. And yes, as I indicate here, deer are not fond of these. So if you have a problem with deer in your yard, this would be a good choice too. And it's cool looking with these wonderful leaves. So these are on stalks about 1.5 feet tall. And in May, they produce these flowers. These flowers have already gone by in the Boston area. And now you're seeing a little green egg-shaped fruit on the plants that had flowers on them. And toward the end of August, very early September, they'll look like this. They'll be yellow and very soft and dark yellow and slightly wrinkly to the touch. And that's the fully ripe stage of mayapples. That's the stage to eat them. And the flavor of a ripe mayapple fruit is very tropical, like a guava. So I definitely recommend them. Make sure it's fully ripe, because an unripe fruit is actually poisonous. I mean, not, emergency room, getting the ambulance poison, but you would know, because the fruit doesn't taste good when it's unripe. It's fully ripe, tastes yummy. So anyway, that is the mayapple. And I have grown these from seed, and it's not hard at all. All right, so another plant that is fun to deploy where you have an issue with potential invasives is this native species called the swamp rose mallow. And before I talk about that, let me just mention, I don't have a lot of experience eating this plant, although it's from a highly edible family. So it's in the genus Hibiscus, like the hibiscus flowers that are used in tea, and those come from a tropical species that I don't believe you can grow here in New England. So these flowers have a different flavor. They have almost like an oniony flavor, like a daylily. Um, but they're up to 6 inches across, which is really showy for native flower. And and so they're worth growing just to look at them, even if you never ate them. And another cool thing I've seen these plants do is grow in the midst of the invasive wetland species like purple loosestrife and Phragmites. It won't replace the purple loosestrife or Phragmites, but it will persist in a spot like that and grow and say to the invasives, I don't care if you're here, I'm growing here. So it is a good choice if you are confronted with the challenge of invasive wetland plants and you want to diversify with a cool native. And I've grown rose mallow from seed. It's quite easy. Here's another plant. This is if you have an upland dry habitat and you want a native plant that you can plant and have it spread a little bit and maybe elbow out to a modest degree some of the other plants growing there that you are less fond of. This is one of our native mints. This is the Monarda fistulosa. Our native one has this purple flower. There is a red flowered cousin of this plant that's actually not native to New England. It's native to Western New York State. But if you want to grow that one, that would be okay. But here's our native one. And let me just say that that mints fall into two basic culinary categories. There's the sweet mints and the savory mints. So a sweet mint would be like a peppermint or a spearmint, and you deploy those in recipes like mint tea, mint juleps, mint ice cream, mint candy, stuff like that. And then there are the savory mints like sage and thyme that you deploy for things like sausage making, pizza toppings, soups, omelets, casseroles. So in my opinion, that's where the wild bergamot falls into, because if you smelled the flowers or the leaves and scrunch them up and sniff them, you would see they smell just and taste just like oregano. So that's how I would use these leaves. And so that's the wild bergamot. Then another native mint, which this I put more in the sweet category because it's very pepperminty in flavor, is the Pycnanthum muticum, or the clustered or broadleaf mountain mint. And the flower isn't as showy because it's sort of white and the petals are very small on it. But in terms of a plant being a pollinator magnet, of all the plants I'm growing in my nursery, this would be number one in terms of the sheer number and variety of pollinating insects I've seen visit this plant. For example, so here's a close-up. So this cool critter called the great blue wasp, the only time I've ever seen this in my nursery is visiting the Pycnanthum muticum flowers. So, so that's a fun thing to see. All right, so goldenrods are good for pollinators too. And and other supporting insects which nibble on the leaves. So Doug Tallamy at the beginning of my show, he likes the Solidago species as supporting caterpillars that support birds and so on. But there is one particularly tasty Solidago, and that's this one, the sweet goldenrod, Solidago odora. It's one of our native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era when they were boycotting the British tea. So the leaves and the flowers both have a licorice fragrance, which will be retained in the beverage that you brew from them, from the leaves or the flowers. And this one is very easy to grow from seed. And I found this out when I bought a bunch of plants from the New England Wildflower Society, and I potted them up, and these plants bloomed and went to seed. And I had little sweet goldenrod seedlings growing in the same pot, the same growing season that I put these plugs into these pots. That is an easy plant to grow. So this seed, needless to say, requires no stratification. It basically, within 2 weeks after you sow it, you'll get your little cotyledons, and off to the races it goes. So very easy to grow from seed. Here's sweet fern, another one of our native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. This is a great plant to grow if you have very poor soil, like gravelly soil, because this plant can produce its own nitrogen fertilizer. It's got the symbiotic bacteria attached to its root systems. So remember that. This is also a clonal species. So once you plant a couple it will produce additional plants in the area and will spread vegetatively. It's actually kind of a challenge to grow from seed because the plant is so successful in spreading clonally. I don't think um, it needs to spread that much from seed. And it's possible that the seed ideally might need actually some fire to trigger germination. You probably don't want to set fire to yard to find that out. All right, so let's go on to the next species, spicebush. Another one of our colonial tea plants. So the colonists would just steep the twigs in hot water for a few minutes and get a flavored beverage that way. This is a cool plant ecologically, and I'll mention that in just a second, but let me talk about the other part that I like to eat, which are the ripe berries, which only occur in the female plants. And if you're buying this species from a nursery, usually the plants are young enough that the nursery won't know what species of an individual plant in a pot is because it hasn't started flowering yet. So my advice is to get multiple plants to increase your chances that you'll get a female amongst all the plants you're buying. And then hopefully if you get a female, you'll see berries like this form in early September. And these berries are about the same size and shape as a Tic Tac, but instead of a sweet flavor, it's a savory flavor like black pepper or Szechuan peppercorn. So that's how I use these berries as a spice. So I will gather them and dry them. And after several weeks of spreading them out in a cookie sheet, they'll shrink and get reddish brown in color. But once they're dried, you can store them in a glass jar in your pantry, and they'll keep for years until you're ready to use them. And then when you're ready to use them, you could just grind them up, little mortar and pestle, and then add them to foods to get the savory flavors. So for example, that milkweed egg puff I showed you earlier in the show, I like to use dried spicebush berries as part of the seasoning in that egg puff. So so two reasons why you might want to plant this plant. Three, I mean, you can eat it would be one reason. Another reason is that deer don't like this plant. So if you have deer problems, there's another plant you might want to choose. And although its natural habitat is as an understory species under hardwood trees growing in a damp, rocky area, often where there's a perennial intermittent stream, that's spicebush's natural habitat. It will grow other places too, including full sun, if that's what you have. Yeah, so deer don't like it, and another good ecological reason to plant this plant are these berries. So these berries are high in lipids, which is a vegetable fat, and these berries have lots of calories in them, and so songbirds will seek them out to fuel their southward migration. So if you are picking spicebush berries in the wild, I encourage you to leave lots of berries on the plants to make sure that the birds get all they need that way. All right, and here's the last reason you might want to grow spicebush in your yard is it's the host plant for the spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So after the little egg hatches, and this caterpillar is about 1/2 inch long, it's trying to impersonate bird poop. So no birds want to eat poop, so that works. And then it quickly morphs into this other form where these are fake eye patches. The real eyes are down here. These are fake eye patches. The caterpillar is trying to impersonate a snake to deter birds from eating it. And then even in the pupa stage, look what a spicebush pupa looks like. It looks just like a dried leaf. So isn't it cool this organism has evolved all these amazing disguises to avoid being eaten? So that is the spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. All right, so here's wintergreen, and the whole plant has that wintergreen tea berry flavor, very common understory species. Most nurseries that carry this, the berries, they're not very sweet, but they do have that wintergreen flavor. And so you could make a tea from these leaves, but if I want to make a wintergreen flavored tea, I tend to make it from black or yellow birch, where you just peel the twigs and then make the drink from the peeled twigs just by putting them in a jar and letting them sit around for an hour. And you can grow black birch or yellow birch from seed, just from gathering the seed in the wintertime after recent snowfall, where the seed just, you can pick it off the surface of the snow and then spread it on the soil surface, and then the plants grow. And these plants are now 2 feet tall in my nursery. Sweet cicely, so this plant grows at Holly Hill Farm. It's not a very common plant, but I'm happy to say it grows easily from seed. And so I've been growing a bunch of it in my nursery. That's what the mature seed looks like. That's what you would sow. And that's what it looks like when it first comes up. And yes, I moved these into my garage just to when they're in the pot stage to make sure they don't get too cold. Um, so in Cohasset, I hope some of you in the audience would know, just from looking at the flowers of this plant, what this species is. For those of you that don't know, I'm going to give you a big hint. This is a boardwalk going over a dune. Does that help you? Well, in case you haven't figured it out, I will tell you these are beach plums. And beach plums, if you have trouble finding them in the wild, you might want to remember the best time to find them is in May when the plants are blooming, because they look like this. Because in September, when the fruit is ripe, it's this purpley color, which is hard to see at a distance. So that's obviously the edible part on a beach plum is the fruit. And they're about the size of a Bing cherry, which is a good size for wild fruit. And they vary in flavor from bush to bush, but sometimes they're very yummy straight off the bush. And beach plums do not have to grow in dunes. You can grow them any sunny, well-drained spot many miles from the ocean. And yes, there's one fun thing to do with them is make the jam or make stuff with the jam, like this arugula. There is an orange fruited version of beach plum that I run into occasionally, where this fruit is at least as good as the purple fruited species. And this, as I mentioned before, another precocious species where the seed will just start sprouting in your fridge and you have to sow it indoors. So there are several yummy viburnum fruits like the wild raisin and the nanny berry. And then here's sumac. So this is not poison sumac, in case you've ever been afraid of these red-fruited sumacs. You were being afraid needlessly. That's what poison sumac fruit looks like. Very, very similar to poison ivy fruit. So if you're seeing upright clusters of red fruit in these tight clusters, it's an edible sumac. The one in this photo happens to be staghorn sumac, but smooth sumac and winged sumac also look the same. And from any of those species, you can make this drink where basically you just pick the ripe fruit. And this fruit's going to be ripe in, let's say, August is the right time to harvest it. Bring it home, throw it in a bowl of water, knead it like you're kneading a loaf of bread. And the fruit will yield the flavor into the water, and the water will turn this pink or pinkish orange color. Get rid of these berries, put this water through a filter, and then you can drink it hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. And there's your sumac drink. And all this text just says, I strongly advise you not to put the sumac seed in your compost pile, because the seed will not be adequately broken down, and you'll be picking baby sumac plants trying to grow into your raised beds or wherever you're using your quote unquote finished compost. So I'm just giving you a word of warning that you might not want to do that. Sumac is a great fall foliage plant. Wild grapes, we have several different kinds that grow here in New England. This is the fox grape, the one that produces the large purple grapes. This is the progenitor of the Concord grape. And these are delicious grapes. You often smell these great wild grapevines before you see them. And yes, you can make a delicious cheesecake from them. Here's another species called Riverside grape, where it also produces ripe grapes. These grapes are smaller, at most about a ½ inch in diameter, and they're kind of musky flavored. They're not quite as good as the fox grapes, but this is the species to make the stuffed grape leaves from, and the time to gather these leaves is now. Between now and the 4th of July, that's when they're going to be fully grown and nice and young and tender. And what you want to look for on the underside of these fox grape leaves is it's smooth and green. And that's Riverside grape, I'm sorry. These are Riverside grape, smooth and green on the underside. And then you just blanch them, drop them into rapidly boiling water for just 20 seconds, and that will help them not tear when you stuff them. And then you stuff them and make your stuffed grape leaves recipes, and there you go. All right, hazelnuts are edible, and we have two kinds here in New England, the beaked hazelnut and the common hazelnut, and they're equally edible. There's the beaked hazelnut. And all this text just tells you, if you want to grow a nut, a plant from a nut, don't let the nut dry out, because it will lose its viability. Keep it moist. So after you harvest the nuts, store them in a plastic bag in your fridge or sow them right away. And then you'll get them the next growing season. And there is our common hazelnut, which I gather under power lines. And I look for these around the second week of September. And you need to pick the nuts off the plants and not when they hit the ground, because after they hit the ground, the squirrels and chipmunks will find them all before you do. All right, here are acorns, and I've grown oak trees from acorns. All acorns are edible. The big issue is how much tannic acid are in these acorn nut meats. And basically, whatever acorn is you gather, you have to leach the tannic acid out. And there's a hot water method to do it and a cold water method to do it. Either method works. White oak acorns sprout basically as soon as they hit the ground. So you need to either sow them or put them into some kind of growing medium, like a bucket full of vermiculite, and have the roots just grow into something like that. You can't leave them in plastic bags in the fridge like you could a red or black oak acorn, or they'll spoil on you. Shagbark hickory is my #1 favorite wild edible out of everything. It's a native species to much of the northeastern part of the U.S. And there's the four-parted husk, and this part often bursts off the shell when this hits the ground, and you're just seeing a whole bunch of these on the ground. And there's the maple hickory nut pie. This recipe's in my book. It's the New England version of pecan pie. And were this to be a live program, I will have made one of these cookies for you. So I'm sorry I'm not able to serve these cookies to you. And once again, all this text says that these seeds have to be kept moist in a bag in your fridge or sown in the ground. This is critical. Any nut that you sow in the ground or in a pot, you must protect with something like this 1/2-inch mesh hardware cloth. I know from personal experience that if you don't do this, these squirrels and chipmunks will dig up their nuts. Even after the trees begin to sprout like this, they'll still dig up those nuts and eat them and uproot your tree in the process. So don't make my mistake. Use that hardware cloth. Black walnuts, I've grown these from seed and they're yummy. You have to get this green part off, which is kind of messy. And then you've got these inside. And then you crack these open to get the nut meat. I use a device like this that I bought from a company in Oklahoma, but you could use a vise if you've got a vise at home in your tool shed. That works pretty well. And then this black walnut honey squares is another recipe that I love to serve at my program. So sorry you're not eating those. Here are some examples of other trees that produce other edible fruits, like these tupelo berries, persimmon, chestnut, beech nuts, hawthorn, hackberry. These grow on the South Shore. I've seen these growing in Hingham, not far from the ocean. And these butternuts are all plants that have native plants that have edible parts to them. Groundnut has an edible part, and although the name is groundnut, it's actually a tuber, a potato-like tuber that's growing underneath the surface of the ground. And I propagated groundnuts from these tubers and from the ripe beans inside the ripe pods. And this is the main edible part, these tubers. And you just slice them crossways and fry them with a little vegetable oil to make groundnut chips. Okay, so the last part of the show, I'm going to very briefly talk about what I'm doing in terms of growing plants and planting them out in the landscape. So for the last 5 years, I'm playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible species. I set up a nursery west of Boston. We're propagating over 1,000 plants. I was there this morning. I'm very happy for the rain today that hydrated all my plants. And then I work out arrangements with cities and towns, organic farms, state and federal agencies, tribal groups, land trusts, and others to plant plants in my nursery in appropriate places in their properties. And here's a list I put together. This list is online of the more than 180 species that are edible by people. So if you have any trouble finding this, feel free to send me an email and I'll point you to the link where this exists online. There's a shot from my nursery when it was a little bit less tidy than it is now, although it's not much better now. There's another shot of my nursery where you see all these nut trees I'm growing in these milk crates with the hardware cloth protecting them. And my stratification fridge, which is also a little neater than it is now. Here's a list of some projects I've done, so let me go through a few of these. Here's an island off the shore of Marblehead that's owned by the trustees of reservations that had good habitat for beach plums, but didn't have any beach plums on it. So I asked the trustees of reservations if I could plant beach plums there, and they said yes. And so I walked around and found good habitat for beach plums, dug the holes, organized volunteers, and then we took the beach plum plants out there and planted them. And so here the volunteers helped me plant the plants. And I would be misleading you if I said every one of the 14 plants we put out there are thriving. Some did not survive. And so I just write this off as just a learning experience because this is one of my early projects. So I hope that I know a little bit better how to plant these successfully in habitat like this. Here's another island. This is Baker's Island, north of Boston in Salem, Mass. That's owned by the Essex National Heritage Area, where I brought out a whole bunch of edible native species. And although it's not happening this year, I do live wild edibles at Baker's Island days every season. Hopefully it will happen next year, where we get to visit all the edible plants that were already out there, plus the additional species I've introduced to that island. All right, so here's a project in Scituate, an island, Bassing Beach, some of you may actually have visited, that's actually owned by the Cohasset Conservation Trust. And I worked with the trust several years ago to plant plants in my nursery out there to further diversify what was out there. So in Western Mass, I partnered with the DCR and the Appalachian Mountain Club to plant edible native plants around 2 new paddler access campsites so that the campers have native edible species to harvest from in addition to the gorp and the other things that they're harvesting while they're planting. And here's in Montague, a similar site where I planted the flowering raspberry and other species to supplement what was there naturally. Here's a project out in Western Mass along Riverwalk in Great Barrington along the Housatonic River where I have supplemented what's growing there with some additional edible native species. Here's a project down in Acushnet, Mass, along the headwaters of the Acushnet River going into New Bedford Harbor and Buzzards Bay, where we planted marsh marigold along the stream there. Here's a project in Lexington where I worked with a town where they did a daylighting project, and after the construction was done, I worked out a planting plan. Then we brought a whole bunch of edible native plants to plant out at the site. Here's the flowering raspberry that I guessed at a good spot where it would be happy, and it is thriving there. And there's the newly daylighted stream. So this used to be a stream in a pipe, and now they've recreated the streamside habitat. That's where I put the flowering raspberry in. Here's a project in Maine that I'm doing with the Maine Audubon Society where I supplemented what was growing there with additional plants in my nursery. And yeah, there's a spikenard plant that's very happy growing in a spot where we planted it. And finally, here's Holly Hill Farm, where I've led several wild edibles walks and hope to do one again next year when hopefully we'll be back to some semblance of normal. We can do outdoor programs. So here, Jasmine Callahan has helped me plant some edible native plants to further diversify what's growing on Holly Hill Farm beyond what was already there. And then I belong to the Wild Ones chapter, South Shore chapter, which meets at the Cape Cod, at the South Shore Natural Science Center. And so here at one of the club meetings, I brought some of my seed to share with club members to do some edible native plantings in their yards. So with that, that's the end of the formal portion of my show. And I'm going to yield the rest of the time to take any questions that you have. And let me just talk a little bit about this book that I've been mentioning through the show. So this book, let me just say, it's about all kinds of wild edibles that are out there. So not just the native ones, but edible weeds and invasives. Like these are autumn olive berries, an invasive species that I like to make fruit leather from. This plant is a chapter on autumn olive in this book. Here's a strawberry knotweed pie made from Japanese knotweed stalks. And then here's some black locust flowers that I mentioned earlier in my show that produce delicious fritters. But there's the beach plums that I talked about in this show, the elderberry I talked about in this show, the black raspberry I talked about in this show, and beach peas, which are native to Cohasset and so on. So, so the book is very useful, especially if you are or near coastal areas of Massachusetts. It's good. And it's a little hard to get the book right now because of the restrictions on open offices and stuff. So if you need to have it mailed to you, you can order it online from B Street Books. If you could drive up to the North Shore and pick it up at Greenbelt's office in Essex, Mass, then you can order it directly from them and just drive up there and get it that way. Okay, so with that, I'm going to just toggle out of here, and we'll have this available in case we need to go back to any screens, but I'm going to return to you, Gail. And so if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
All right, Russ, that was absolutely fantastic. A lot of information there, and I'm thrilled that uh, we're going to all walk away with some valuable information and customizing our gardens. I do remember growing up in Cohasset and having a sister who was a gardener, and she would make sumac juice. So that it was nice to see that in the presentation. I've gone ahead and unmuted everyone. So if anyone has any questions, let's see. Or if you want to chat, put it in the chat box there. I don't see any questions just yet, but I do want to remind everyone that this is the first of 3 gardening lectures. You'll need to sign up for next week's lecture. It's called Attracting Native Pollinators, and that will be presented by Blackstone Valley Veggie Gardens, and it'll be at 3:30 next Thursday. I want to thank the Community Garden Club of Cohasset for sponsoring this event. Does anybody have any questions?
All right, well, while we're waiting for questions, why don't I pull up one of the slides that I had to breeze through, because I can talk a little bit more about what's here. Okay. This one. All right, so are you seeing this slide, Gail?
Yes.
Or do I?
Yep, I am.
Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about these. So hackberry in the upper right-hand corner. This is a very interesting native fruit. This is one that the Native Americans used extensively. For example, in something called pemmican, which is a Native American equivalent of power bars, where they'd pound up these fruits and mix it with animal fats and other dried nuts and berries and stuff like that. And they would have these very highly bars they would take with them on journeys. They wouldn't have to be hunting and gathering while they were traveling. So let me describe the flavor of a hackberry. So this outer part right here, the thin pulp on these fruits tastes almost exactly like a date. So that's really good. And then the center of these fruits has a starchy seed, and that's very good. The thing is, between this outer fruit and the inner seed is a shell. And it's not like an M&M candy shell, it's an actual shell. It's a thin shell. It's thin enough to bite through if you wanted to. But, with our spoiled taste buds, it's probably one explanation why you're not seeing hackberries for sale all over the place, because you don't hear people saying, oh, I just sat down to a bowl of hackberries and boy, was it good, because, chomping down on the seeds, you run into that shell. And as I said, it didn't deter Native Americans at all from eating this fruit and using it in pemmican and stuff. So, so if that doesn't sound very appealing to you, you can just nibble on the outside, the date part, and which is a good idea anyway. If you're trying to save the seed for propagating the plants, you wouldn't want to bite into it anyway. And persimmon. So persimmon is one of these species that does not grow naturally in southern New England, but it will grow here now if it's planted here because of climate change. Our climate has gotten sufficiently temperate enough that this species will grow here in most habitats. If you had a really cool microclimate, like a shady north-facing slope, I wouldn't recommend it in that spot. But if you've got a sunny location with some good depth to your soil, persimmons will grow. And although there's lots of cultivars there, I find our straight species native, the Diospyros virginiana, to be a delicious fruit. So you don't have to grow a cultivar. You can grow a straight species native, and they are available. So I encourage you to try that. And why don't I just pick one more in this slide to talk about, and that's the tupelo. So this is also called black gum, and it can be a very common coastal species, and it likes damp areas and that are somewhat sunny. It can tolerate a lot of shade. It doesn't have to grow in full sun, like dappled sunlight is enough. And these trees will get to be 30 or 40 feet tall. Um, and the fruits are the edible part of the plant. Um, but once again, you haven't, seen tupelo fruits for sale because there's not a lot of pulp on each individual fruit. It's kind of thin, so the seed is rather large in these. By the way, these fruits are about as big as a jelly bean. So they're good size, but most of what you see is composed of the seed, and the pulp that surrounds the seed, it's very tart. So if you enjoy nibbling on a tart thing, then you'll really like the tupelo seed. And I have seen, although I haven't done this yet, I have seen tupelo trees where there's branches that are low enough to reach the ground, and they're fruiting so prolifically that I could pick enough fruit so that I could process that fruit and have enough to make drinks or jam or jellies from the fruit pulp of the tupelo seed. But so far, I've just nibbled on it as I encounter it, and I'll nibble on it before I save the seed and propagate plants from the seed. And this one is very easy to grow from seed. I must have 60 little baby tupelo plants in my nursery right now that are 3 inches tall that I grew from seed I gathered last fall.
Hmm. Russ, we have two questions.
Okay.
Stephanie asks, what would you recommend for someone wanting to get into foraging? It seems overwhelming and not sure where to begin.
Oh, okay. So probably the easiest thing is to start with species that you already know. Like, for example, dandelions, when they were in season, just about everybody can recognize a dandelion. And in late April, early May, the part I recommend harvesting are the flower buds before the flowers open. And they're one of my favorite vegetables, period, cultivated or wild. And they taste like a cross between corn, spinach, artichokes, and Brussels sprouts. And you just blanch them for 60 seconds, and then they're done. You can eat them on the spot or incorporate them into different dishes like soups, omelets, and casseroles. And if you're going to gather dandelions, don't gather them from heavily fussed over manicured places like closely cropped lawns and golf courses where they're using chemicals to subdue the vegetation. Pick them in a place where the plants get nice and shaggy and big, like the edge of an organic farm. And speaking of organic farms, there's good foraging opportunities in the edges of organic farms. And there's one weed that they have coming in right now that's also very easily to identify weed and is very prolific that I definitely recommend as a beginning forager to get into. And that is purslane. So it's not in my show, today's show, which focused on native species because it's a non-native plant. It's not invasive. It's just a garden weed. It only grows where we are, like where we're trying to grow things in our own home vegetable or gardens or organic farms. So this is a succulent plant with a spatulate leaf. So if you have any trouble finding it, just ask your local organic farmer, do you have any purslane? And I think they'd appreciate help with the weeding. And the plant's edible raw, it's edible cooked, it's good for you. It has high in iron, omega-3 fatty acids. And one great way to use it is to put the purslane leaves in a gazpacho. And you don't even have to make the gazpacho. You could go to the store and buy the store-bought gazpacho and just throw the purslane leaves in there, and the texture of the purslane leaves works really well in a gazpacho. So there's two things I'd recommend just off the top of my head for a beginning forager.
Thank you. Lisa asks, how can we easily avoid poisonous native fruits?
Oh, all right. So I've been at this for 40 years, so that would say that I seem to be knowing what I'm doing. And I would say, and this is a comment that relates to New England or the northeast part of the US, so this isn't the world over. But as far as I know, and I've been at this for a long, long time, I do not know of any fruit that grows in this area that tastes good and is poisonous. So if you're pretty sure that you see a fruit that you think is edible, So you want to obviously avoid things like poison ivy or poison sumac, where you get contact dermatitis just from touching the plant. And they would be especially harmful if you ingested them and swallowed them, what the adverse reaction would do to your digestive system. So absolutely, absolutely don't do that. But if you see something that looks, let's say, like a raspberry or blackberry, and you put it in your mouth and you give it just a second or two taste, and it doesn't taste good and it tastes bad, and you made a mistake and you spit it out, the worst that could happen is that you feel nauseous for a while, and that's probably because you scared yourself to death more than anything. So this isn't an activity that I do routinely, so I didn't learn what was edible just by popping stuff in my mouth and see what happens. You know, all the trial and error work's been done by Native Americans, many other people over millennia, so we can benefit from that accumulated knowledge. But it does mean that you can use your taste buds as a backup identification tool for fruits, to give a fruit a very quick taste and just be ready to spit it out if it doesn't taste good. Because I'm happy to say that the vast, vast majority of poisonous fruits that grow around here taste horrible. So my advice is don't eat fruits that taste bad, and you should know right away.
All right, thank you. Let's see, does anybody have any other questions? No, I'll just, in closing, I just want to remind everyone that the Cohasset Library is open for curbside pickup. That means that you can place a hold on items held by the Cohasset Library, and within a couple of days, we'll get to it and bag your hold, check it out for you, and you can pick it up in our parking lot under the tent. We do have several books, I know, on edible plants and such. So you might want to browse the ocln.org catalog and for edible plant books, and perhaps you can check that out. Again, Russ, I want to thank you for your time and for all the information you've given us.
Yes, I apologize for the technical glitches we had at the beginning, but hopefully we were able to get those out of the way in the first 15 minutes, and the rest of the show is pretty normal. And I've just thrown up my email here on this slide. Please, if anybody has any lingering questions or you think of something after the show, feel free to write me, and I will be happy to respond to them.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us.